Hello, Potomac Crossing Ward. This is the lesson for Come Follow Me 2020, Book of Mormon, lesson number 29, covering Alma 36 through 38. So, for general comments on Alma 36 through 42, these chapters form Alma's closing remarks to his sons shortly before his departure from the land of Zarahemla, probably a few months later. We see him leave in 45:18. It's plain from his own comments that Alma is less than happy with the conditions of the Nephites, and Mormon portrays Alma as pretty unhappy. Alma has spent a great deal of time trying to keep the Nephites on the right track and has had mixed results. He apparently has had enough of the Nephites and he just leaves. But before doing so, he gives his sons Helaman, Shiblon, and Corianton his final blessings. We might speculate that in the remaining time before he leaves, Alma's traveling around to the other churches in and around Zarahemla to put them in order as well and to say goodbye. From these chapters, it's safe to assume Alma only had 3 sons. As far as daughters, there's no mention of any. Given the nature of the text focusing on Alma's ministry and not his personal life, it's possible he had younger sons and daughters, but they didn't play an active role in Alma's ministry, so they didn't end up in the text. He obviously had a wife at some point, but there's no mention of her either. As his departure in 45:18 presents it as a solitary event, that seems to suggest that he was a widower at that point. It seems unlikely Alma would abandon any non-adult children, so he probably had no younger children than these 3 sons mentioned. If there were any daughters or any other sons, they were likely peers of these 3, and they were probably married by this point, or they were adults and self-sufficient. The complex and deliberate structure of these chapters and the lack of any conversation between Alma and his sons point plainly to the text originally being 3 letters written to each of the sons and given to them prior to his departure from the land of Zarahemla. The letter would have been scribed into a record, presumably by Shiblon, as he inherited the plates from Alma, or perhaps Alma himself inscribed them prior to leaving. Now, this is not to say Alma didn't deliver the content of the letters to his sons verbally, but the text of these chapters is clearly a deliberately crafted work and not the recounting of an extemporaneous dialogue, like we see later on when Helaman and he talk and he actually leaves. There's a conversation going back and forth where Alma says, "Hey, do you believe?" And he says, "Yes, I believe." And then they go back and forth. There's a conversation there. There's none of that here in these chapters. Okay, so comments on chapter 36. This chapter is a much more verbose and stylized account of the events detailed in Mosiah 27, where it talks about Alma the Younger's conversion after being confronted by the angel. The text of this chapter is highly structured. There are microstructures within macrostructures. The format is clearly deliberate on Alma's part, as the account is a verbatim quotation of Alma from his own record. It is not a stylized arrangement after the fact by Mormon. Given its complexity, it's safe to assume this work took a considerable amount of time to compose, and Alma invested a great deal of effort to do so. Now, in the Book of Mormon, this is one of the best-known chapters when it comes to textual structure and Semitic poetical devices. It's been featured in a number of different articles, including in the October 1989 Ensign. Donald W. Perry wrote an article named Hebrew Literary Patterns in the Book of Mormon, and he identifies a number of them, and this chapter includes one of those. If you want a general sort of like straightforward introduction to Hebrew Semitic poetical devices, textual structure, that article is it's a pretty good introduction to basic forms. So again, that's Ensign, the October 89 Ensign Donald W. Perry, Hebrew Literary Patterns in the Book of Mormon. And in my comments posted on the website, there's a link that you can click through, and it takes you right to the church website for that copy that you can print. The primary subject of the chapter is Alma's conversion to the gospel, but there are a number of sub-themes as well. One of the more obvious sub-themes is that of corporate versus individual salvation and how they interact. In verses 1 to 2 and 28 through 30, Alma emphasizes the importance of remembering Israel's history and all the Lord has done for his fathers. This is in accordance with the angel's admonition in Mosiah 27:16. Obviously, when there's corporate salvation, you have individuals within that body who are interacting individually with the Lord, and the Lord has to get all these people in line to have a corporate salvation. To deal with a huge population, he needs to make sure that all of the people in that population are working. So. His statements concerning remembering Israel's history bracket his recounting of his own conversion story. What's the connection? As Nephites are natural Israel, the descendants of Lehi through Manasseh, and the descendants of Mulek through Judah, the various covenants which apply to Israel apply to them. The various covenant blessings and curses in the law, so this is reference Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, all apply to them as well. And as the nation of Israel is composed of many individuals, the Lord is bound to deal with individuals as well as the nation. In this particular case, the Lord was very merciful to Alma in not destroying him outright, but rebuking him and giving him an opportunity to repent. The result was Alma repented and became quite zealous for the Lord. And this follows the typical covenant curse pattern where the Lord chastens Israel until they repent. We see that particularly in Leviticus 26. So the large-scale corporate dealings of the Lord filter their way down to individuals. Also note the way Alma personalizes the typically corporate formula for being cut off or prospered in the land in verse 30. This admonition is most often used in a corporate sense, but King Benjamin also personalizes it as well. We see that in Mosiah chapter 1, verse 7. For a similar discourse on applying the general covenants with Israel as a whole to a relatively small group, compare King Limhi's comments in Mosiah chapter 7, verses 17 through 33. One other sub-theme throughout this chapter is the Lord as deliverer. The Lord delivered their fathers. He delivered the church from Alma's subversions. He delivered Alma from death and hell, and then delivered Alma from trials and tribulations. The role of deliverer here is defined as both physical and spiritual, as well as both corporate and individual. And clearly it necessarily implies the Lord is very active at both the corporate and individual levels. Now, a lot of times we like to see the Lord as dealing with large groups of people, but clearly here Alma is talking about a very one-on-one relationship that he's had. Okay, comments on Alma 37. Alma passes on the plates and probably the Urim and Thummim and Liahona as well. So note in verse 47, he talks about the things in plural that he's passing on to Helaman. This suggests that all of these artifacts are being passed off. The discussion is meant to convey the spiritual meaning and symbolism of these artifacts. They aren't just curiosities. They are important devices meant to guide and help the Lord's people. But one exception in this chapter is Alma's talking about the plates, the importance of the brass plates and the importance of the 24 gold plates. But Alma emphatically tells Helaman to not release the full contents of the gold plates because of the danger, the risk of these secret combinations. And that has to be driven by Alma's personal interaction with all of these apostate Nephites. He knows that if secret combinations get out among the Nephites, that it's just going to be the death of them. But unfortunately, his grandson Helaman, so there's Alma, Helaman, and Helaman, his grandson Helaman ends up running into secret combinations anyway with Gadianton and was it Kishkumen? So they end up running into problems with that anyway. Um, Alma doesn't leave until chapter 45, probably some months later, and the text doesn't explicitly state that Alma makes Helaman high priest at that point, but all of the evidence clearly points to that being the case. Here, Alma is clearly preparing him to take over. Why the delay? My assumption here is that Alma's traveling around to the other churches in and around Zarahemla to say goodbye and to set things in order before he leaves. Okay, and then comments on Alma 38. So this one chapter is dedicated to Shiblon, and Shiblon appears to have been pretty zealous, but apparently with something of a problem with pride and maybe some arrogance as well. Alma's comments to him are derivative of his comments to Helaman in chapter 36, but with careful editing. And then in my comments, I lay out, man, you really can't see this, it's washed out. I lay out the parallels between the two chapters and where Alma selects the verses and the parallels between these two addresses. The material Alma selects to present to Shiblon focuses more bluntly on having a testimony of the Lord's deliverance of Shiblon and Alma's own spiritual rebirth and firsthand knowledge of Jesus Christ's saving power. Why? Verse 9 informs us Alma wants Shiblon to have the same kind of understanding of Christ's salvation that he has. So Shiblon obviously hasn't received it yet. Now, in the text here, it talks about Shiblon being a teacher. So whereas Helaman ends up being the high priest, the lead minister among them, the lead priest, Shiblon appears to be a teacher. So it seems like Shiblon understands things intellectually, but he doesn't have that experiential level of conversion the way that Alma had. Now, Alma came by that pretty hard, and I don't think that Alma is suggesting that Shiblon go through the same kind of horrible apostasy situation. But what he's doing is he's asking Shiblon to humble himself and really have that deep conversion and that experience with Christ himself, so that he'll be a more effective teacher and he'll have a stronger, more powerful testimony, but it'll also help him to be more humble in his relationship. Shiblon hasn't humbled himself before the Lord yet, as Alma has, therefore has not received a remission of sins and a powerful testimony of Christ, as Alma has. Verses 10 through 14 inform us why he hasn't. Alma's intent is to encourage Shiblon to continue to be zealous in the Lord, to abandon his pride and experience the Lord's spiritual power of deliverance, as Alma has experienced, as he has experienced the physical powers of deliverance. So Alma is saying, like, look, you've been physically spared, because like he was stoned and thrown in bonds among the Zoramites. So now Alma is saying, look, you need spiritual deliverance as well. You've had that physical experience, and that's taught you, and you've endured that well. Now you need to have that spiritual conversion, that spiritual experience as well. And then Alma's comments to Helaman would be longer, as Helaman was being selected to take over as high priest. Here Shiblon is apparently called to be a teacher, and we see that reference in verse 10 and 15. So Shiblon is acting as a teacher among the church. Okay, so that wraps up the comments for this week. Next week we get into Corianton, a more difficult case for Alma.